Welcome back to another episode of Real Talk, everyone. I hope that you are all doing well as this premieres. If you're new to the channel or haven't seen any of these videos before, this is a place where I get to offer some impromptu, unscripted takes, while at the same time combining it with one of my favorite hobbies of all time, that of fishing. My reflection for you all today is on the nature of digital realism. I was recently going through the archives of essays, talks, and works of the late John Perry Barlow, a man whose life is certainly one in a generation, from lyricist to philosopher, and a man who had a certain idealism when it came to the digital world. Recently, I was reading a talk of his in 1994 of Jack In, Young Pioneer. And I couldn't help but think as he offers this kind of digital optimism of the early 1990s, it seems to reflect quite well where just a century ago in 1893, Frederick Jackson Turner wrote about the significance of the frontier on American history and the American people. See, for Frederick Jackson Turner, the frontier line was the line in which people became Americanized. As Europeans came here and as the Englishmen moved further west throughout history, they fundamentally changed, not just from their Anglo-American roots or, say, their German or other European desires, but the wilderness would change them and make them this new, fundamentally American character, where we would take on the moccasin and the hunting jacket and become like the Indian to plant our corn before eventually settling in waves of those who would make it safe for the next wave to build infrastructure and roads, and then the third wave of those who could safely bring their families and set up schoolhouses and businesses and become part of a new frontier community. And in part, this is sort of the same logic that came as the frontier closed. When the West was closed, when there was no more frontier line, the Transcontinental Railroad came, America fundamentally changed. While there was still wild, free, open spaces, there were not many places that one could say was the frontier. There were settlements, there were plans to grow, land speculation, and so on. And so 100 years later, the same idea came for the digital frontier, the main digital landscape. Barlow's talk can be found, ironically, on the Electronic Frontier Foundation, something that he was a big part of. And when I read through it, I can see this sweeping amounts of optimism that comes through, where he says things like, "The frontier, the virtual world, offers opportunities and perils like none other before it. Entering it, we are engaging what we will likely prove to be the most transforming technological event since the capture of fire. I have a terrible feeling that your children, by the time that they are my age, would barely be recognizable to me as human, so permanently jacked in to the great mind will they be." End quote. I can't help but think to myself that that part is certainly true. I am terrified, even now as a man in his later 20s, looking at Gen Z and Gen Alpha, or whatever comes next, that generation that is explicitly raised in the great mind, the great global technological digital village. I've talked about this concept at length many times before, that the great mind is the greatest deracinator of all time. It's something unlike Frederick Jackson Turner's The Frontier, where it would transform you into a hardy frontiersman, a man who could hold his own against nature, savage, and other wilderness of Mother Nature, but instead we lose those traits for something else. We talk about coded language on how to get around censors. We talk about the battle lines that are drawn between knowledge and how we can understand ourselves to ratio journalists or something like that. And at the same time, the men that may have written the poetic Eddas nowadays are writing 12, 15-hour-long video review essays on video games and the like. Big events, of course, are never seen in advance, but we have now almost 30 years to look back on Mr. Barlow's talk, and I can't help but realize that that optimism of the early and mid-90s is gone. And we live in a world where we have to be fundamentally more realistic about what there has to be. Now, of course, Barlow was willingly hedging his bets, and he was actually being quite smart about this as well. No one came close to predicting the future, and he certainly was aware that his optimism could be fundamentally wrong. For instance, when he talks about the government in this discussion, he tends to think that the government would be a blind and rabid animal when it comes to the digital world, and to some extent that's still probably true. Lord knows our aging bureaucrats and policymakers have no idea what they're talking about when it comes to things like Reddit or any other forms of social media technology, which makes Silicon Valley really one of the most powerful aspects of our modern world. They're American in a lot of ways, yes, but at the same time, they're their own unique identity. Average people can't relate to those in the Silicon Valley startups or those that work for some of the most powerful companies on Earth, the ones that control information. Yet at the same time, all of this power, social, technological, the way that it influences our neural chemistry, our psychology, and our makeup, is indicative of the fact that they are very much on the shoulders of an unstable object. Morgoth has a great video about this where he talks about the internet being essentially elephants on stilts. In a lot of ways, the power structure that enables Silicon Valley to last is on those same stilts as well. But at the same time, we have to be realistic about those stilts. Much of our connections in the real world, as well as with like-minded individuals, are also on those stilts as well. This is why there has been this fundamental desire to return to the frontier, a fundamental desire to return outside of a digital world. We're not the Amish or the Neo-Luddites that are going to be taking up axes and tar and feathering printing centers or data centers all across America, but rather we recognize that society, the misfits and dreamers that now run it, in the same way that nerds have been affected by programmer socks and hormones, the same way that the Great Society affected black communities, they're the ones that are in charge of things. The real inversion has indicated that ideology is incredibly powerful, and when you have a tool to propose that ideology to spread to the masses, or can control what ideas are seen, one can only look at things like rate limiting happening at the same time as these ongoing riots inside of France. I know just by saying that this video is dated, but it indicates how powerful that the government can be in respects to the fact that, no, it doesn't necessarily have to have a complete understanding of how the world works, but they do know how to levy their own influence and power on top of the various concepts of making sure information doesn't get out, and knowing that these companies have to play ball or else. So when it comes to the aspect of realism, what do I mean by this? I don't mean it in just the international relations sense that so many of you know me by, but I mean that we have to take a look at the fact that the wilds of, say, Ogden, Utah, or the 49ers rushing into California and dealing with the nature and the society of these little shanty towns as they try and pan for gold, that doesn't exist anymore. It's not the Usenet days, it's not the forums or image boards of early Internet 1.0. And this isn't to say that there aren't pioneers. Obviously there are. There are some that look at the world in this digital environment that say, yes, there is still pioneering. Whether this is the startup state, this digital concept of taking up all of our capital and our knowledge and moving somewhere else and starting new, like the Praxis Society, I can't help but think to myself and wonder, well, what does that mean for the rest of us? Not all of us are going to be frontiers. Some of us are going to be the second or third waves of settlers, and some may simply say, we'll just stay right where we're at, and we'll make do. That's often the joke that many people make about flyover country, is that they found a good place out in the middle of nowhere and said, I think we're not going to go any further. The digital world, however, is different. It's constantly changing. It requires you to know what it is. It embodies the idea of the New World Man, as sung by the great Canadian prog rock band Rush, that they know constant change is here to stay. In fact, that really is the only mainstay of our digital world. How many other platforms have risen and fallen before our very eyes in the last 20 years as people tried to make competition and try to advance a way that keeps users interfacing with it, typing on there, and have it as addictive as humanly possible. This is the frontier and habitation that we have now. The misfits and the dreamers that Mr. Barlow was talking about, well, those misfits and dreamers are advocating for a world where anyone can be trans and anyone can do what they wish, as long as law and order allows them to have their pet material goodies right at their doorstep. But for us, we also recognize that the digital frontier has very much been conquered once the Federals find their way into these western frontier towns. For us, I think one only needs to look at the trial of Doug Mackey and recognize that he's being tried in a separate district far from his residency because that's the server in which his tweets were being filed out of. It's an insane world to think about that any single one of you in America could be the next Doug Mackey. This is the situation that we live in, that the frontier has been conquered. It is no longer the early days of bleeding Kansas where free speech advocates and those advocating for open source are fighting against the government. One only needs to look at the mysterious and dubious circumstances of Aaron Swartz to recognize that maybe something has gone terribly wrong in this battle for the digital frontier. There are, of course, some critical differences between the differences of the frontier of old and now cyberspace. Cyberspace is everywhere. The information superhighway has roads that can lead you to places that are deliberately signed up and designed for you to go in places that you don't want to be in. One only needs to look at Google and recognize that it's gotten worse over the years, that most of the internet is inhabited by the digital undead of bots that aren't even human, and that the only real qualia test nowadays is your ability to have a complex thought or being capable of saying words that the bots don't like. It's not one great machine, as Barlow describes, it's a continuously wide-flung wave of the heavens, or in this instance, I think more so hell. We live in now 30 years of sort of this digital frontier, and unlike the near century it took for the American continent to be conquered from its early days in the 1790s to now looking abroad for an empire in the 1890s, it only took 30 years for the digital world to be conquered in some respect, that we know there are things that we can't say, there are things that we know we can't do, and setting up something new is very hard to find, lest you be like the frontiersmen of old and court yourself to those that know that they can finance your project and that you are beholden to them. Rebels are no more, at least in some respects they are, although lest you end up like Cody Wilson or someone else in jail or under the worst circumstances of being an expat, this is the digital world that we live in. I think about all of these things because I look towards the future. I look towards the fact that things are becoming more automated as sort of an effort to bypass the ongoing competency crisis that we are well knowing ourselves heading into. Ironically, Palladium Mag, of all people, had a great article about this, discussing how the competency crisis won't survive the complex systems that it inhabits. What's going to happen when we can no longer find the right people to run things? Those that are veterans of the service industry and know how to be engineers, programmers, and technical people, when you're really looking for individuals that have overcome adversity or are looking towards class struggles because they happen to overlie with race, and that's a convenient way to get around Supreme Court rulings. The structures of what made the frontier are collapsing. The frontier's freedom is collapsing, and I don't know whether or not a new frontier will be forged. I say this, of course, knowing full well that I have no idea what the future may hold, and like Mr. Barlow's optimism in 1994, my discussion nearly 30 years later in 2023 may also age terribly. But knowing what has taken place in the last 3 years, over-centralized control of media narratives regarding medicine, elections, and the rule of law, I think that the frontier has well become paved over, that the transcontinental railroad has been made, and that every computer, lest you build one from scratch or have a different kind of operating system, has some hardwired or some built-in back door so that governments can turn on your camera and see what you're doing inside your own little log cabin. The optimism of the early internet is dead, and what now exists is the realism of dealing with an anarcho-tyranny that is both very much in your face, that you can feel it breathing down your neck, but you can also feel it as you type. One only needs to look around and see how everyone ranging from podcasters, artists, and journalists are deplatformed, depersoned, and debanked for what they say online. This may feel redundant to some of you old heads out there, but for those that are coming of age and those that have come of age in this post-2007 world, the frontier has been closed. And just much like Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier, we have been fundamentally transformed. Not as new Americans, but in this instance, part of a great global homogenizing village of the digital longhouse. One that tells us that we all have to speak the same way, with wide eyes and wide-armed TikTok gesticulation, telling us that this is the world that we live in, and to rebel and to seek a new land is forbidden. Just as much as exit was outlawed in this country over a century ago, the same thing, I imagine, will come for many digitally. If not, it has already come. This requires a sobering and realistic expectation for how we can navigate online and recognize that this frontier is closed, but perhaps the boundaries and the world around us, the one that advocates for decolonization and the destruction of the world as we know it, offers a new wild frontier, with the same kind of savagery, foreign laws, and understanding that'll allow us to conquer, or at least have our own homesteads out in the wilderness, both in the cities and out in the great yonder. These are just some of my thoughts for now, and I hope that you've all had a very good time listening. I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Take care, God bless, and be prudent, everyone.